Good evening. Hello. Hey guys. Hi, welcome to the ICA. I'm Rose Widow, one of the curators here. We're pleased to be starting off a new talk series, which is called Technology Now, which amazingly we don't have much technology on the stage, so no screen, we took our in-house section at home. But basically this is a talk series that will be roughly monthly, so those of you that know the ICA, please just keep checking our website, and those of you that are new to the ICA, there's loads more of these, so please come back. It's a series that's examining the influence of new technologies on art and culture. We're inviting artists, writers, thinkers, theorists to come and talk about their work and propose possible futures for technologies and new ways of relating to the technical means of permeate our lives, society and environment. So it will be broad and varied, and we're excited. So come back again for Boris Groys, will be speaking next month, the artist Christopher Clinton Thomas, and then later in the year we'll also have Wendy Chuck. This evening, though, we have Jussi Parikka and Martin Howse, who I'm delighted to introduce. Jussi is a professor at the Winchester School of Art, and is based between here and Istanbul, so we're pleased to have him here this evening. Jussi has been super important in shaping our current understanding of network culture, aesthetics, and media archaeology. And we know him for the incredible trilogy of books, Digital Contagions, Insect Media, and most recently A Geology of Media, in which he describes the complex layers that constitute media knowledge production under the technological condition of the Anthrobscene. In addition, Jussi has published What is Media Archaeology and edited various books, most recently Writing and Unwriting Media Art History, which looks at the work of the Finnish media art pioneer, Alchemical. Apologies for pronunciation. And these books, and also his recent essay book, Anthrobscene, you can all find at the bookshop. Please do take a look. Throughout his work, Jussi has shown great sensitivity towards contemporary artists and contemporary artwork. So it is brilliant that Martin is also here to be in conversation with him this evening. Martin Howse is an artist, theorist, programmer, and filmmaker who is based in Berlin. So again, thank you very much for travelling and getting within his time. You are returning to the ICA, so you've done various projects and a performance in 2012, which was Substrate. But I just wanted to read out the materials list because I sort of feel, you'll find a clip on video, and I feel it says a lot about your work. So this was a performance, and the materials list was prepared CD-ROMs, hard disks, sulfuric acid, laser, and custom electronics. So in Martin's work, we see an occupation with an artistic, interdisciplinary investigation of the links between Earth, software, and the human psyche. He has pioneered numerous open laboratory-style projects and performed, workshopped, lectured, and exhibited internationally. And from 1998 to 2005, he was director of APP, a software performance group working with electronic waste and pioneering an early approach to digital glitch. In 2006, Martin co-founded XXXXX, organising a large-scale conference and concert series in London, and publishing the acclaimed reader XXXXX, and I believe also
Is that what it was called?
so far, also here at the ICA.
Yeah.
Yes, so this evening, I think, Jussi, you're going to talk to us for a little bit, and then we're going to have a demonstration. I may leap around and do some health and safety things. Basically just stay away from it, around 3 meters away, if you could. And you're welcome to stand up and take a look inside as well. Then we'll be in conversation, and then I think we're really keen to hear from you guys. So if you have questions, please come forth, and we'll do that at the end. But for now, please join me in welcoming Martin and Jussi. Thank
you. Thank you very much for having us. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to start the new series as well. Can you hear me okay at the back? I'll try to speak up. I like the line about showing sensitivity to contemporary arts. That's why I brought the goggles as well. No, actually Martin brought them, and Martin's going to do the spectacle quite literally as well. I apologize for being there. I'm supposed to be the warm-up act for something actually warming up things, and hopefully it will work like that as well. I was asked to talk a bit about what I've done in the most recent project on obscenities of Anthrobscene, and Geology of Media. So I'll talk a tiny bit about that, very broadly only, and a couple of themes and a couple of things that relate to Martin's work, without going into really awkward things of analyzing your work at all. Instead, giving a context where some of the things you will do and talk about might make sense, and perhaps offer a platform for future further discussion as well. Okay, so I also decided not to even show any pictures, which, again, because of the spectacle that's going to follow, is probably a good idea. So I was asked to talk about the Anthrobscene and also the Anthrobocene, which is of course a combination, perhaps a slightly awkward or cheesy combination of Anthrobocene and obscenity, that I will in a way explain as well why the obscene nature of what we're living and doing in relation to technologies and the planetary condition. But I'm really happy to be in dialogue with Martin for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think that, well, I talk about Martin's work and other works as well quite extensively in A Geology of Media book, so there's an obvious connection there as well, and I'm kind of offering a sort of a warm-up to Martin's, that wasn't planned to happen. Now they bring in the massive equipment, the lab equipment, and the chemical experiments that are going to follow. There's also another reason why Martin is here and we're in dialogue. It relates to how I kind of try to write things as well, in the sense of being in dialogue, writing with certain art practices, certain both ideas, but also the literally material practices that emerge in the body of work, the body of contemporary artwork that Martin and others are doing, and showing this sort of a rather chemical side to contemporary arts as well. And that's one of the reasons why I offered a sort of a written cartography, whereas this sort of a art method cartography has already been happening, and it was really instrumental in terms of how I was thinking through. Surely the word Anthropocene doesn't need much introduction. It's pretty well discussed over the past years in many art institutions, in many humanities institutions, as one possible term for the planetary era we are enveloped by. The impact of not only high science and technology, but other sorts of deep times, including agriculture and agricultural practices that are sort of a more grey level to this, things we do that have an impact on the soil, in the air. Perhaps we could talk about the Anthropocene as a sort of a chemical era, a new chemical period that launched synthetic chemistry since the late 19th century, with the material revolution that followed. A mobilization of minerals, other materials, plastics, dozens of other new materialities that entered the scene. The definition of all rare elements by 1939, leading to a new sort of a world of chemical practices. Benjamin Bratton has referred to the Anthropocene as a planetary level design brief, something that I.L. Weizmann has also done. Planetary level design brief. Never, of course, explicated as an intentional design brief for sure, that in the midst of the mess of so many dimensions, necessitates now to undo that design brief with alternatives that are of similar magnitude, of a planetary level magnitude. So perhaps this new chemical era, also speculatively a new design material period, a new art historical period, registers in different chemical compositions of the earth, in the air, in the light. in the light that is released through the ozone-depleted atmosphere, an era of increased ultraviolet radiation of light and audiovisual art of a planetary scale, massive art installation called Earth, which is unfortunately registered in ways like skin cancer. Hence, we can think of this, also following Benjamin's ideas already, as a design period, an extended deep time of technological media arts that starts as an explosive proliferation of materials that replace the dependency on just key materials of just over 100 years ago or so, what we were dependent on: wood, brick, iron, copper, gold, silver, and hence enters a different sort of material period of material production and material sciences, from labs to research and design R&D departments, with massive repercussions for the world outside it. Not only in terms of what was produced in terms of new end-user technologies that might be convenient for the media arts and audiovisual spectacles, but also in terms of the other end of the long continuum from the Earth's materialities to technological culture. The supply chains that for some of the raw materials, such as rare earth minerals, feed to technological, gradually computational solutions we sometimes call just media. So, a chemical period of meticulous production, standardization, refinement of minuscule elements, not least minerals and metallic earths that are crucial for the microchip technological society. Even single electronic device or a microchip is a condensation of mineral resources, knowledge of their potential usefulness, and the future possibilities of them becoming, again, a resource. So, if in the context of architecture, we already talked for a long while of skyscrapers and as inverted mines because of the amount going into infrastructures of actually building those things, you can start to measure cities by their accumulation of metals and materials. And you can start to measure the extended mobile virtual cities and zones of electronic devices and infrastructures as an extension of this architectural realization as to the material world. Cities might be the mines of future, as Jane Jacobs had it for a long time ago already, but similarly also the technological world is the mine of the future. Obviously, don't be mistaken that the focus on mineral realm of the technological modernity, would be only a realization of late 20th century, or our age of the midst of the Anthropocene discussions. The metallurgical became a leading motive in such accounts as Mircea Eliade's different sort of accelerationism way before the term became pop. The practice of accelerating the supposedly natural time of the geological by way of chemical reactions. The alchemic and then the chemical knowledge that becomes a sort of a refining of timescales, the supposedly slow, deep times, but manipulated. The sorcery of time manipulating operations and intervention into the earth time as well. To tease out a different materiality suitable for screen technologies, LEDs, sustainable battery technologies, military equipment, and other sorts of technologies that form the way in which signals flow, screens illuminate, and information is stored. It was already articulated a long time ago, an inkling of this period. Louis Mumford's account from 1930s recognizes that the new technological period is not about the devices only, it's about what the devices consist of. Also the new power sources emerging from the underground, but now increasingly more portable. Instead of coal, the portability of petroleum. It's also a period of metallic earths, many sorts of tantalum, tungsten, thorium, cerium, iridium, platinum, etc., different sort of a vocabulary for art history. Early 20th century was itself a sort of an early wave, of course, of various mechanisms of audiovisual, office, and other technologies, significant as a media archaeological lessons as to the material necessities of why offices became technological, homes became technological, from bakelite to selenium. These tiny material hinges were essential for the everyday to become exactly that, to become everyday, to become the backbone, the silent infrastructure of things that just work, function for us, for automation to happen, normalization of that society dependent on technological infrastructures and dependent on material, political, and economically securitized supply of materials for the infrastructures. This is why there's a really interesting thing to focus on those places of a different sort of a media history, of these labs like Bell Labs and others. So important not only for the innovation work, the term innovation or invention, but also for the actual material proximity in those sites of chemical labs, chemistry labs with innovation as well. It's not only the elements, those elements that we talk about, but the new practices of heat that defines what could be called a thermoculture of media technologies. So there's a really lovely paper by Nicole Starosielski coming out where she pitches this idea of a thermoculture of media. Marshall McLuhan might have talked about cold and hot media, but this is rather different. Nicole Starosielski reminds that we shouldn't be focused only on solitary elements that we find in the periodic table to understand geologies of media. We should be looking into different ways of manipulating materials by way of heat, by way of also sustaining media technologies as specifically conditioned by certain thermal conditions, warm enough, cold enough, a climate control for the media technological world while the planet itself warms up. So, at this point you might ask, where's the obscene in that? You might wonder with a sense of disappointment, expecting something more interesting by way of pornographic, or at least by way of Baudrillardian. So what's the obscene in that? I use the qualification of obscenities to underline, like many others too, that the term Anthropocene, which is very species-oriented, is rather inadequate to notice the existence and reproduction of imbalances, asymmetries, differences, and fluctuations that the term holds together, hence the variety of alternative terms that recognize certain political economic, gendered conditions, etc., like capital C. The Anthropocene is a weird term. It's a term that seems to be signaling a unifying take on the planetary, like some earlier previous terms did already. The Anthropozoic age was coined in the 1860s, followed by George Perkins Marsh's meditations from the same decade, where he mentioned to speak of man, and yes, man in that way, man's reaction upon organized and inorganic nature as a modification of the materiality structures of this earthly home. Same thing in the midst of 20th century, the new spheric meditations by the Jesuit priest Teilhard de Chardin. Same thing for later terms such as Gaia. Same thing for many other terms in the various guises, an imaginary of planetary unit that then becomes requalified, luckily in feminist theory, political economy, and more. So what is the Anthropocene if not a manner of distribution of waste, a production in ways that emphasize the distinction between the global south and global north, the impact that is measured not only in species, but according to genders, geographies, and more. After realizing that it's a limited elite crowd of about 100 companies or less than 100 companies that are behind 2/3 of global warming related emissions, one starts to realize the rather different sort of a picture that is painted. One of obscenities that are rather systematic, not species being, but a specification of a different sort. a post-human situation, but in a way where corporations such as Chevron, Exxon, BP, and others are the ones of a post-human sort, like Sean Cupid has mentioned. So Sean Cupid is an apt commentator here as well, reminding that there is nothing less than a neo-colonial arrangement on a global scale, a planetary situation of slow violence, to use Rob Nixon's term. So the trouble with that comes with the term Anthropocene is that our ardent theory enthusiasm for terms, of course. Well, put it like this. The speed at which we're hungry to adopt new concepts as part of the curatorial cycles is only matched by the boredom, the ennui, that follows from the intensive but short debate about them, only to be followed by a replacement, as if being bored is enough of a reason for conceptual change. Perhaps one needs something more lingering, more complex attachment to terms and concepts that might fit in with cycles of art institutions or even academic institutions nowadays. I'm speaking here as a media theorist. So although a media theorist who's employed in an art school and trying to understand that some of these questions through art methods and at least art practices, my attachment to the whole discussion was through alternative routes that didn't start with the Anthropocene, that started talking about materialities of media technologies. Close your eyes and think of Friedrich Kittler. New materials feminisms, think of Rosie Braidotti. And other sorts of alternative routes to avoid the necessity of talking pro or against the Anthropocene. I wasn't very interested in that. I wanted to engage directly with a range of works, very limited set of works, of course. It's only a book. From Trevor Paglen to Katie Patterson to Garnet Hertz, Martin's work, solo work, but also with Jonathan Kemp and Ryan Jordan. Then later I wrote about Abelardo Gilles Fournier's work and other people's work as well. In this context, as one way of understanding some connections between technical media and contemporary art practices as well. And in a way, sort of an interesting idea of how this, especially what Martin's been doing as well, relates to a rethinking of contemporary land arts and earth arts as well. I was interested in how these practices, ideas, feed into what could be called a minor vocabulary for media theory and minor vocabulary for some art discussions as well, and aesthetics. I want to talk about the earth, the planetary, and the various intensive qualities that define the planetary as well. So I think that a lot of work, of course, has done that for already. Art in the Anthropocene, edited by Heather Davies, Etienne Turpin, does a good job in articulating how this notion is extremely relevant for art and art practices, illuminating that the Anthropocene itself is a sensorial experience, and primarily also understood through planetary level visualizations and media technologies, satellites, computer simulations, but also a third aspect, why it would be relevant. Third aspect, to continue with them as well, that art provides a site of experimentation for, I quote, living in damaged world, they write referring to Anat Singh's beautiful, grim words. Living in a damaged world. So in the context of already rich body of context, I don't think we have and afford to just move on because for the sake of moving on. There's something that we need to get stuck with these concepts and the urgency of these as well in relation to practices. And aesthetic and visual and technological production of the situation. And I've been still interested in the question of what other sorts of complementary and continuing discussions we can have around these themes as well that can have an impact in media art and media theory. One of my favorite terms in the book was psychogeophysics, not a term that I invented, that comes from a variety of people whose work preceded mine already in art practice as well. Psychogeophysics as it pertains to what Martin was doing as well, together with Jonathan Kemp, but also Oswald Berthold, Wilfred Huyebeck, and others, as a way of understanding of a call to move further from the psychogeographic, the situationist vocabularies for art practices and mapping the urban effect on its inhabitants, to call for a more radical appreciation of the planetary level affordances of how geophysics has an impact, broadly speaking. Echoing of vocabulary similar to Robert Smithson's and others in our earth arts, but also speaking of psychology as the plate tectonics of the mind, and emphasizing the geophysical reliance, cultural forms. To quote that earlier text in Mute magazine, the land masses move, cease, wander. Continental drift does not need punning by a contemporary Walter Benjamin. Things happen anyway. But the psychogeophysical shouldn't be only taken as a shock and awe of the tectonic scale of the volcanic eruptions and these sort of slightly or more than slightly male-obsessed connotations. The resolution here cannot be a distancing that follows from a feeling of sublime horror or apocalyptic fantasy about the world without us, Anthropocene, as a erasure of the anthropos or from the scene, which probably will happen anyway, but rather the opposite, rather something that is always cued in alternative ways by feminist theory as an impulse to be entangled instead of distancing. What are the sites? What are the ways? What are the affects? The modes and materialities where the geophysical entangles with the psychological or the embodied and the experimented upon. How do we move from an anthropocentric model to a more geocentric, as Braidotzis has suggested, or to a more otherwise decentered post-human account, something not to be perhaps mistaken for transhumanism nor object-oriented ontology? How do we employ this as a methodology for experiments and assays, situated knowledges too, that doesn't resolve everything to a human scale, or perhaps instead, for instance, chemical reactions? So the psychogeophysical is instead a way to tap into these other relevant ways in which to discuss the extensive connections that contemporary technology now has with technology about 500 million years ago, and perhaps the future as well, and the planet's resources as well. It's a term that helps to consider how then contemporary current forms of land art might work. Land art that isn't only about the spatialities of non-urban sites, but aware of the mobilization of land rather concretely as well, of earthly resources and a planetary conveyor belt, from rare earth to energy, synthetic matter to the junk devices that return to places where they can be more easily discarded. These sorts of entanglements are of a planetary scale, but they also written on the skin, on internal organs, as respiratory problems from air pollution, the chemicals that seep in the skin with the build-up measured in years, the slow violence of chemical disasters or just electronics as they are opened by bare hands. That sort of an inscription system. A couple of words more, because this relates to a really kind of a curious way to understand media theory as well. So in one of the kind of one grounding story of media theory, at least in some of its traditions, the German media theory, the material media theory, Friedrich Kittler recounted the curious case of Dr. Daniel Paul Schreber, a judge in Germany at the late 19th century and early 20th century who suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. It was a famous case for psychoanalysis and many case studies, and Kittler also reads Schreber's case and memoirs as a sort of a meditation on the emergence of technical media culture. So for Kittler, Schreber's hallucinations, and then there are these heavenly scribes that note down his words and thoughts, and it was matched up by the idea that Schreber's, in his paranoid world, his body was also a writing surface for the new technical media that penetrated him, the new worlds of seemingly immaterial rays, pierced by heavenly rays, these nerves connected to cosmic realities. Kittler in a way recounts through this psychopathological case an allegory to what happens when technical media enters as a way to write on our skin or through our skin. The fables of seemingly immaterial and yet so effective matters of writing down technical media systems as they impact on the body. But instead of Schreber, what if there is a different way to start recounting how technologies scribe on the skin and in bodies as well? What if the contemporary Schrebers are not so much suffering necessarily from paranoid schizophrenia, but from toxic imbalance of different sorts, especially the underpaid workers in the global south, locations from Pakistan to India, West Africa to other regions, who dismantle electronics for their useful waste material without necessary protective gears, exposing the skin and the internal organs to toxins and their effects that register also the body of effects of these electronic technical media, register them as cancers, miscarriages, and more. This sort of an anthropocenities of technical media culture are a different sort of writing down on a different sort of a skin than Central European German judges' skin. Cannot be resolved in an easy narrative of an immateriality of information, or even the aesthetics of the digital, as we often discuss in a rather contained and clean way. And it also extends to a different sort of a narrative, away from the narrative of media technology from the heart of Europe to its contemporary roots in the global south. So what if the media age, even the media artistic age, is one that is measured through this sort of a new sort of aesthetics in the body, on the body, in the air, etc., also on the planetary skin as well. The chemical era of industrial pollution is itself this sort of a speculative, we can read it as a speculative suggestion of an art historical period that we're living in. Not one of particular genres that emerged in contemporary media arts only, but a planetary art historical period that is measured by different levels of light, as mentioned, that are filtered through the atmosphere because of ozone depletion, causing an increased ultraviolet century. The air pollution toxins and smog hovering over megacities, causing their visual screens, visual media, the visual environment to look rather differently. The chemical era measured in digital arts and toxins, a sort of a geology of media, not only restricted to what stays on the ground, but refers to a contemporary version of land arts where the planetary is constantly and rather literally deterritorialized and often re-territorialized in those machines, in those devices. It's moved and shifted, deplaced and replaced across the surface of the planetary skin and on top of its surface, and indeed registered on the vulnerable organic surfaces, whether of the earth or our health. That's my short introduction. Thank you.
Thank you.
Martin.
Thank you, Jussi.
Too, and,
well, thank you, Jussi, and thank you for inviting me here to the ICA to converse. Respond. So what I'm going to do now is talk a bit about my work, a few ideas, try and tie a few things together, and then what I'll probably do, I make some kind of experiment which I will introduce when the time comes. But what I'll probably do is prepare the elements over here and talk about them rather than going over here, and because then it just makes things easier. So okay. So what I wanted to start off with, so I would say that my primary preoccupation in work, which is also to do with the skin, which is here stained with silver nitrate at the moment, from preparing something yesterday. My preoccupation is more or less like, how is meaning in materials, or how does meaning come to get into materials? And technology is one way that symbolic structures are literally etched and, I was going to say burnt, but they're not really burnt, but more or less Sorry?
Heated up.
Heated up, mined, etched, reconstituted, recrystallized almost within the symbolic structure. So these materials come to make meaningful technological structures, which then come within this whole circuit of kind of media theory to then produce even more, to kind of write people and write stories. Like this one thing which I was kind of obsessed with was more or less within, this is going on a slight turn, but within the, which also relates to Kittler, because he was also talking about the Bram Stoker's Dracula, more or less describes these kind of early media writing machines, the gramophone, the typewriter and so on, and then within the frame of psychogeophysics, which almost kind of encapsulates one thinking about psychogeophysics, I don't know whether it's my theory, but a theory is more or less that the Earth within Whitby, where he set the story where he was living at the time, which inspired him to write Dracula, this kind of somehow something there wrote Dracula for him, like he was written by the geophysical, because there are certain mineral conditions within that part of England, and these were literally turning him into a writing machine. But that strays from the point somewhat. So what my interest is more or less like, how does material and language material and symbolic structures, material meaning, how are these two things together, which is obviously a very classical question, which also one thing I started thinking about, like if you look at Dante and you have this the forest of the suicides, and these trees are the human trees that are bleeding and speaking, so they have become this kind of meaningful matter, which also somehow relates to the Anthropocene, or this, you're talking about Gaia, that you have this, without it being necessarily this meaning, not necessarily anthropic or human meaning, but something which is, it's not just, which somehow relates to the quotation that from Jussi's Geology of Media, but the quotation is from Thomas Pynchon, unfortunately, or fortunately.
No, it's better.
So this is from The Crying of Lot 49, and I'll describe a bit about the background once I've read it out. So the line is, behind the hieroglyphic streets, there would either be a transcendent meaning or only the earth. And this is also in an essay from Kittler called Electromysticism, which we translated. And it's more or less, so what's happening is that earlier in the book, the heroine, Oedipa Maas, describes looking out over this kind of newly built section of California, where they're building these kind of condos or whatever they build, and seeing it as if it's a circuit board, the same that she's seen on the inside of the radio. So the idea is that is this kind of layout, does it have some kind of meaning? Because the whole novel is about paranoia, that there's something behind this whole technological structure, or is it just Earth? There's nothing, but it kind of flip-flops between these two things, and maybe it's not necessary that you either have just the Earth, just material, or just meaning, or just material, just meaning, or something. So that's kind of what I'm interested in. So what but how this relates to technology is also that what I became interested in before I started looking particularly at the materiality was in software, and software is kind of, in some ways, if we look at it in a certain sense, it's working in the opposite direction. Like you have this thing which is nothing but meaning, these kind of symbols that then does something in the world, like empties your bank balance, but also does something materially in the world at the same time, and this starts a whole other, so you have these kind of multiple circuits almost of the kind of the imposition of structures on the world through agriculture, and how these structures then create other meanings. Somehow I lost it there. So, so what I'm gonna, and so through this interest, in how those two things kind of fit together, which has also included some works which deal with literally putting software onto the skin, like translating small micro operations within a central processing unit into the movements of a needle on my own skin. So you would literally like open a web browser, and every single micro instruction this web browser is running is translated into a different height of a needle. And I had to slow things down so that basically opening the web browser would take 8 hours of needle movement. So this was literally taking those instructions and putting it onto the skin with this idea that we work through in psychogeophysics, more or less around this notion of sites of execution which ties in with the whole like Anthrobscene thing that you literally describe software as executing. That's what it does when the words become real almost, or when they're actually doing something. That's execution, and execution is obviously when the word of the law is executed in, so we were visiting famous sites in London like Tyburn, which is very close by, which were these historic sites of execution, and the question was more or less, where does this thing called execution happen? Is it in the mineral? Is it in this little processor? Is it on the skin? Is it deep in the earth in a mine where these things have come from? Where is it? So we made several kind of investigations of these different places, let's say, or which also relates to the kind of the land art thing of like, these are more like non-sites of execution. So what I'm going to do is, so through, so through these kind of investigations, like over the last 3 or 4 years, I became interested, and this also came, I must say, this came partly through working with the Crystal World with Jonathan Kemp and Ryan Jordan. This was one start on this investigation of these kind of rare earth minerals like gold, silver, palladium and things like this, and the extraction from technology, but this is going in a slightly different direction, which is more or less my recent interest in alchemy, particularly like medieval to medieval, early Renaissance alchemy, particularly kind of English tradition, and because there seemed somehow there was something there which was overlaying this materiality, this meaningfulness. You have these kind of emblems which describe chemical actions, but they don't really describe chemical actions. There's always this play that everything is kind of receding. It's like this non-site of execution is these kind of alchemical emblems. So if you can imagine, as I'm speaking, that there is projected behind me the emblem of a green lion eating the sun, and the sun is bleeding red blood, I think, more or less, red blood into the earth, which then the lion is standing on. So somehow this almost becomes some kind of cycle, which I was interested in relating to technology. So what I'm going to attempt is, within the frame of this kind of dissolution experiment, let's say, which is more or less taking some alchemical recipes, very simple, speeding things up a bit, using this propane mix, and doing things on a very small scale. So what I'm interested in is, through this process, is transforming what is a mineral or a mineral salt into a breath, so almost like my voice, which might convey some kind of meaning, to then transform gold or technology and dissolve this. So I'll explain a bit as I try and prepare this. Any questions? Feel free to. So I have two possibilities, because it can go in two possible directions, but I know which is kind of, that's empty, which is the kind of the quickest way. So one possibility, which is kind of conceptually more interesting, but which is not likely to succeed, is to use, this is weathered iron pyrites. So it's been weathered by rainwater artificially, to make iron sulfide. And what is interesting is that if we place this in here and using a tube, so this is called, this is basically distillation, but distillation is called dry distillation or high heat distillation. So we basically heat the mineral to melting point, some vapor comes off, we distill the vapor, which is a liquid, which is then acidic, and will dissolve different metals. And the interesting thing there are lots of interesting things to do with this. Like this was produced in large quantities in these kind of farms in the Thames in the 18th century to produce sulfuric acid. But this is also produced in huge quantities by the mining of nearly any other mineral, because it's one of the most common minerals. So what happens is that you bring up huge quantities of these pyrites, rainwater washes through, and this is how you have more or less, it's not necessarily a very direct pollution, but it is the cause of acid in rivers and streams from mining. Is not through kind of dumping acid, but it's actually just bringing this stuff to the surface and exposing, so you're kind of exposing this. Yeah, but this is not what we're going to use. What we're going to use is, and this would work with sea salt, which I've done before, to produce an acid which can dissolve, or two acids which dissolve gold together. So what we will use is potassium nitrate or saltpeter, which is also what I'm interested in is that these have all come from the earth in some senses, not in quite a rough, dirty manner. So this would be also farmed in large quantities in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. Now it's produced industrially, using manure, urine, waste offal, things like this, which would then, through bacterial action, result in these kind of potassium crystals, which we have here, which are used with ammonium chloride or sal ammoniac together to produce aqua regia. This would be produced from urine or hair, again, now industrially. So these are all things this is part of an ongoing project, which is more or less how to dissolve technology using only the earth, let's say. So what I'll do is I carry on talking while I mix the two things together. So my interest is also within alchemy, is at what point did that shift over to become, let's say, kind of instrumental chemistry or something like this? So like at what point do you abandon or just like discard what isn't working, discard this whole symbolic living idea of the earth and produce something entirely different, which is then generating these technologies which also have something of that. So we have the ammonium chloride, potassium nitrate. So it's the same process of distillation that we'd use for distilling liquids, alcohol, and so on, and on a very small scale. And this is it's going to have to be quite fast, because normally I would spend a lot more time like drying the material. And it kind of also goes against the whole ethos of alchemy, where you're actually taking time, days, weeks, months, doing things within certain lunar or solar cycles, following a certain order of operations. So it's more, I don't know. I'm just trying to think. But within this, there's also this question of how that particular kind of alchemical tradition relates to contemporary technology, and that perhaps they share certain ideas about this notion of improving or accelerating nature, which we spoke about earlier. Which is how also somehow kind of alchemy goes, or certain, again, it's very hard to in shorthand say alchemy when you're talking about a huge tradition of thousands of years, but certain traditions kind of are more or less against a kind of Christian doctrine where you're more or less saying that the earth is somehow ruined or perverted, or and then you go into this kind of more Gnostic thing that you're actually trying to make earth and nature more, how to say it, more pure or more, yeah,
Purified, at least.
Or to improve on nature, to solve these mistakes, to make it, but actually to make it something which is readable, which is transparent, which is kind of interesting in the context of technology. Okay, so now what we're going to do, this is going to be tricky. So this goes in here. It's more like a cooking. And the quantities involved are kind of minute, which also makes things, well, that should be okay. So then this is the kind of, the breath, or somehow the vapor should come through this tube. How are we doing for time? Good. Yep. I've also done this on like a large scale in a deserted like site in Berlin, and the security guard was convinced we were doing something drug related.
I was about to.
And he was kind of like, I don't care what you're doing, but just tell me what. I was like, no, it's nothing to do with drugs. It's like, no, come on, look, just, you know.
Yeah, in Berlin.
On this scale, yeah. So also, I don't know, I'm doing. Oh. So some of this relates to this, or one text which is called The Hunting of the Green Lion, which is in a collection of alchemical verse called Theatrum Chemicum Britannicum, collected by Elias Ashmole. But I won't read it out, I don't think. Not the whole thing, but no. So what we do is, okay, so I'm going to move now over here. I was trying to find. Oh yeah, this is what we need. So this will be the kind of the receptacle for the breath, or what we could call some kind of angelic voice. Yeah, sure. The chemical box, of course. The box of the. So, we have the gloves. I mean, it looks more dramatic than, you know, than it is. The problem is I can't actually do anything. Joe, your lighter, you see.
Oh, damn. True. We need it. Unless somebody else has a lighter. He's like the magician's assistant who doesn't. Is not prepared. It's got a lighter. Good.
Thank you. So I'm going to put the gloves on after I've. Sorry about this. So it tries to try and dry it a bit. And there's some vapor, but mostly it's supposed to be water. Most of the vapor is kind of escaping here, unfortunately. I think there's one drop. I'm just going to try a slightly different because to try some gold leaf in the actual here. Just to see whether the vapor will eat the gold. So, not super conclusive, maybe wait until something settles. Having problems with the alchemical furnace regulation. Yeah, the glass melted, which means you can't really carry on. Maybe something will happen. But it wasn't an overwhelming success, but more for demonstration.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I think it's time to go get some dinner. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for coming, and thank you for all your contributions. It's really great. But thanks to you guys. Please join us.